Debunked Arson Science. On December 23, 1991, a fire destroyed Cameron Todd Willingham's home in Corsicana, Texas. His three young daughters, 2-year-old Amber and 1-year-old twins Carmon and Cameron, died in the blaze. Willingham escaped the burning house, but couldn't save his children. Within hours, fire investigators determined the fire was arson. They identified over 20 indicators of intentional fire setting, burn patterns on the floor that supposedly showed accelerant had been poured, crazed glass that allegedly proved extreme heat, and other signs that the fire had been deliberately set. Willingham was arrested and charged with murdering his children by arson. At trial, fire investigators testified with absolute certainty that the fire was intentionally set. The prosecution argued Willingham had killed his daughters for insurance money. He was convicted and sentenced to death. For 12 years, Willingham maintained his innocence. He filed appeals arguing that the fire investigation was flawed, but courts repeatedly denied his requests for new trials or expert review of the fire evidence. In 2004, just months before Willingham's scheduled execution, renowned fire scientist Gerald Hurst reviewed the case. Hurst had decades of experience and had helped overturn numerous wrongful convictions based on bad arson science. When he examined the evidence against Willingham, he was shocked. Every single indicator that investigators had cited as proof of arson was actually normal fire behavior. The floor patterns weren't from accelerant. They were flashover patterns that occur in intense fires. The crazed glass wasn't from arson. It's common in house fires. The pour patterns weren't pour patterns at all. Hurst concluded that there was no evidence the fire had been intentionally set. It was an accidental house fire, tragic but not criminal. He submitted his findings to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, begging them to stop the execution. The board refused to hear Hurst's evidence. The governor of Texas declined to grant a stay. On February 17, 2004, Cameron Todd Willingham was executed by lethal injection. His last words were, "I am an innocent man, convicted of a crime I did not commit. I have been persecuted for 12 years for something I did not do." After Willingham's death, additional fire experts reviewed the case. All reached the same conclusion. The fire investigation was based on outdated, debunked methodology. Modern fire science showed no evidence of arson. The Innocence Project, the Texas Forensic Science Commission, and independent experts all concluded that Willingham was likely innocent. The investigators who testified against Willingham had used arson indicators that were proven unreliable years before his trial. Courts had allowed testimony based on junk science. And when real experts tried to correct the error, the system refused to listen. In 2009, the Texas Forensic Science Commission began investigating whether Willingham's execution was a mistake. Their preliminary findings indicated that the arson determination was unsupported by science. But political pressure led to the commission's chair being replaced, and the investigation was effectively shut down. Multiple investigations since have reached the same conclusion. Cameron Todd Willingham was almost certainly innocent. The fire that killed his 3 daughters was accidental. The evidence used to convict him was scientifically invalid, and Texas executed him anyway, ignoring experts who tried to stop it. Named the real killer. On February 4, 1983, Wanda Lopez was stabbed to death during a robbery at a gas station in Corpus Christi, Texas. A witness saw a Hispanic man with a mustache fleeing the scene. Police found Carlos De Luna hiding under a truck nearby about 40 minutes later. He had a mustache. He was Hispanic. He became the prime suspect. De Luna told police he was hiding from someone else, a man he knew named Carlos Hernandez, who had threatened him earlier that night. He said Hernandez was the actual killer. Police dismissed this as an obvious lie. There was no Carlos Hernandez matching De Luna's description in their records. At trial, the witness identification was shaky. The witness had seen the killer for only a few seconds, in poor lighting, through a window. But she identified De Luna at trial. A single drop of blood was found on De Luna's shirt, type O, same as the victim. De Luna also had type O blood, as do 45% of the population. No other physical evidence connected him to the murder. De Luna insisted throughout the trial that Carlos Hernandez was the real killer. The prosecution argued Hernandez didn't exist. that DeLuna had invented him. The jury convicted DeLuna of capital murder. He was sentenced to death. For 6 years, DeLuna fought his conviction. He continued to insist that Carlos Hernandez was real and had committed the murder. His lawyers tried to find Hernandez, but couldn't locate anyone matching the description. Appeals were denied. On December 7, 1989, Carlos DeLuna was executed by lethal injection. He was 27 years old. His final words included, "I didn't do it, but I know who did." Years after DeLuna's execution, a team of private investigators and journalists began looking into the case. They found something that shocked them. Carlos Hernandez was real. He existed. He lived in Corpus Christi. He looked remarkably similar to Carlos DeLuna. Same height, same build, same mustache. And Carlos Hernandez had a long history of violent crime, including knife attacks. Multiple people came forward saying Hernandez had bragged about killing Wanda Lopez and letting DeLuna take the fall. One woman said Hernandez had threatened her with a knife at the same gas station where Lopez was killed, just weeks after the murder. Investigators found Hernandez's criminal records. They had existed all along. Police had simply failed to look for them properly. If they had conducted even a basic search, they would have found a violent criminal matching DeLuna's description exactly, living in the same area with a history of similar crimes. A comprehensive investigation published by Columbia Law School in 2012 concluded that Carlos DeLuna was almost certainly innocent, and that Carlos Hernandez was the actual killer. The report detailed the striking physical resemblance between the two men, Hernandez's confessions to multiple people, and the complete failure of police to investigate DeLuna's claims. Carlos Hernandez died in prison in 1999 while serving time for another violent assault. He was never charged with Wanda Lopez's murder. Carlos DeLuna had been executed 10 years earlier for a crime that Hernandez committed. Coerced Confession at 14. On November 10, 1983, a 14-year-old boy in South Carolina was arrested for the rape and murder of an 11-year-old girl named Sabrina Buey. George Stinney Jr. was African American. The victim was white. It was 1944 South Carolina. Stinney was taken into custody and questioned without his parents present, without a lawyer, and without any adult advocate. Police claimed he confessed to the murder within hours. No written record of the confession was made. No recording existed, only the police officer's word that the confession had occurred. The trial took place 81 days after his arrest. It lasted 2.5 hours. Stinney's court-appointed lawyer called no witnesses and presented no defense. The all-white jury deliberated for 10 minutes before convicting him. He was sentenced to death. On June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. was executed in South Carolina's electric chair. He was 14 years old, the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. At 95 pounds, he was so small that the executioners had difficulty fitting the electric chair's components to his body. They had to use a phone book as a booster seat. For 70 years, Stinney's conviction stood. Then in 2004, a local historian began investigating the case and uncovered troubling facts. There was no physical evidence connecting Stinney to the crime. The supposed confession was never written down or signed. No transcript of his interrogation existed. Witnesses came forward saying they had been with Stinney at the time of the murder. He couldn't have committed it. But these witnesses had never been called to testify. Some said they had tried to tell police but were ignored or threatened. Most damningly, a man came forward claiming he knew who the actual killer was. A white man who had confessed to the murder on his deathbed. This man had never been investigated. In 2014, 70 years after Stinney's execution, a South Carolina judge vacated his conviction. The judge ruled that Stinney had been denied due process, that his confession was likely coerced, that he had ineffective legal representation, and that the trial was fundamentally unfair. The judge wrote, "Given the particularized circumstances of Stinney's case, I find by a preponderance of the evidence standard that a violation of the defendant's procedural due process rights tainted his prosecution." George Stinney Jr. was officially declared innocent, 70 years after South Carolina executed him. He had been 14 years old, barely tall enough for the electric chair, killed by a state that never bothered to verify if he had actually committed the crime. Wrong blood type match. On May 10, 1984, a woman was raped and stabbed to death in her Virginia home. Police found semen at the crime scene. The victim's blood type was B. The perpetrator's blood type, based on the semen sample, was type A. Police arrested Roger Keith Coleman, the victim's brother-in-law. Coleman had type A blood. He also had a prior conviction for attempted sexual assault. Based largely on the blood type match and his criminal history, Coleman was convicted of rape and murder. He was sentenced to death. For 8 years, Coleman fought his conviction. He insisted he was innocent. He agreed to take a polygraph test. He passed. He begged for DNA testing of the semen evidence, but courts refused. The technology existed, but Virginia law didn't require it. Coleman's case gained national attention. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine with the headline, "This man might be innocent. This man is due to execute." Supporters rallied for clemency. But Virginia Governor Douglas Wilder refused to intervene. On May 20, 1992, Roger Coleman was executed by electric chair. His last words were, "An innocent man is going to be murdered tonight. When my innocence is proven, I hope Americans will realize the injustice of the death penalty, as all other civilized countries have." After Coleman's execution, his supporters continued to fight for DNA testing. They believed it would prove his innocence. In 2006, 14 years after his death, Virginia finally agreed to test the DNA evidence. The results came back. The semen found at the crime scene matched Roger Coleman's DNA profile. But there was a problem. Further investigation revealed troubling questions about the DNA testing. The evidence had been stored improperly for years. Chain of custody was broken. The sample had been handled by multiple people without proper documentation. Some forensic experts questioned whether the sample could have been contaminated or switched. More importantly, other evidence emerged that had never been presented at trial. A witness came forward saying she had seen another man, a known sex offender who lived nearby, leaving the victim's home around the time of the murder. This man had type A blood. He had a violent criminal history. He died before Coleman's execution. Coleman's legal team discovered that prosecutors had withheld evidence that might have pointed to this other suspect. They had failed to investigate him thoroughly. They had focused exclusively on Coleman because of his prior conviction, ignoring other possibilities. The DNA match appears to confirm Coleman's guilt, but serious questions remain about the reliability of that DNA evidence after decades of improper storage, and about whether a fair investigation was ever conducted. What's certain is that Coleman was denied the DNA testing while alive that might have confirmed or disproven his guilt definitively. Witness admitted she lied. On August 23, 1976, a police officer in Texas was shot and killed during a traffic stop. 3 witnesses identified Reuben Cantu, a 17-year-old, as the shooter. Cantu insisted he wasn't there and had an alibi. But the witnesses were certain. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. For 9 years, Cantu maintained his innocence. His alibi witnesses, friends who said he was with them that night, were never seriously investigated. His appeals were denied. On August 24, 1993, Reuben Cantu was executed by lethal injection in Texas. He was 26 years old. 12 years after Cantu's execution, one of the key witnesses came forward with a shocking admission. He had lied. Juan Moreno, who had been wounded in the same shooting that killed the police officer, told reporters that he had identified Cantu under intense pressure from police and prosecutors. Moreno said police had threatened him with deportation if he didn't identify Cantu. They had shown him Cantu's photo repeatedly and told him that Cantu was the killer. Eventually, Moreno identified Cantu at trial, but Moreno now said, "I'm sure it wasn't him. They killed an innocent person." The second key witness also recanted. He admitted that he hadn't actually seen the shooting clearly and had identified Cantu based on police suggestions rather than his own memory. Even more damaging, the co-defendant who had been with Cantu that night, who had received a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against Cantu, came forward and said Cantu wasn't involved in the shooting at all. He said police had pressured him to implicate Cantu in exchange for a lighter sentence. An investigation by the Houston Chronicle in 2005 found that Cantu's trial had been riddled with problems. His court-appointed lawyer had been paid just $800 and had done minimal investigation. Police had focused on Cantu because he was a known gang member, not because evidence pointed to him. Prosecutors had suppressed evidence that might have supported his alibi. The district attorney who had prosecuted Cantu reviewed the new evidence and admitted, "We did execute an innocent man. Reuben Cantu was 17 years old when he was arrested. He spent 9 years on death row insisting he was innocent. He was executed based on testimony from witnesses who later admitted they had lied or been pressured to identify him. And he was innocent." DNA excluded him. On June 13, 1986, a woman was raped and murdered in Virginia. Police found semen at the crime scene. Based on witness descriptions and blood type analysis, police arrested Joe D'Ambrosio for the crime. D'Ambrosio had a criminal record and fit the general description of the suspect: white male, early 30s. At trial, witnesses testified they had seen him near the crime scene. Forensic experts said his blood type matched the perpetrator's. He was convicted and sentenced to death. D'Ambrosio spent 20 years on death row maintaining his innocence. He filed multiple appeals requesting DNA testing of the semen evidence. For years, prosecutors fought these requests, arguing that the other evidence was sufficient and DNA testing was unnecessary. Finally, in 2006, a court ordered DNA testing. The results came back. Joe D'Ambrosio was excluded. The semen found at the crime scene did not match his DNA. He was innocent. D'Ambrosio was released from death row in 2010 after spending 22 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He had come within weeks of execution multiple times before the DNA testing was finally ordered, but D'Ambrosio was one of the lucky ones. He got his DNA test before execution. Many others didn't. In 2010, Texas executed Claude Jones based on a single strand of hair found at a crime scene. Jones had requested DNA testing of the hair for years. Texas refused. After his execution, the hair was finally tested. It belonged to the victim, not to Jones. It provided no evidence of his guilt. In 1992, Texas executed Leonel Herrera despite DNA evidence that suggested his innocence. The Supreme Court ruled that new evidence of innocence, even DNA evidence, was not grounds for overturning a conviction if procedural rules had been followed. The problem is systemic. Many states don't require DNA testing before execution, even when biological evidence exists that could prove innocence or guilt. Courts often refuse to order testing, saying that other evidence is sufficient. And sometimes, even when DNA testing excludes the executed person, states argue it doesn't prove innocence. It only proves that particular evidence doesn't match. Bite mark pseudoscience. In 1992, Levon Brooks was convicted of raping and murdering a 3-year-old girl in Mississippi. The key evidence against him was bite mark analysis. A forensic odontologist testified that bite marks found on the victim's body matched Brooks' teeth with absolute certainty. Based largely on this testimony, Brooks was convicted and sentenced to death. Brooks spent 16 years in prison, including years on death row, maintaining his innocence. His lawyers fought for DNA testing of biological evidence from the crime scene. Finally, in 2008, DNA testing was performed. The results excluded Brooks entirely. He was innocent. Further investigation revealed that the actual perpetrator was a man named Justin Albert Johnson, who had committed an identical crime in the same area around the same time. Johnson's DNA matched the evidence from the Brooks case. But here's what makes this case even more disturbing. The same forensic odontologist who had testified with absolute certainty that Brooks' teeth matched the bite marks had also testified in Johnson's trial, claiming that Johnson's teeth matched different bite marks from the other crime. The expert had been absolutely certain in both cases. He was wrong in at least one, possibly both. Brooks was released in 2008. He had been hours away from execution multiple times before DNA testing was finally ordered. The problem isn't just that Brooks was wrongly convicted. The problem is that bite mark analysis, the science used to convict him, has since been thoroughly debunked. Study after study has shown that bite mark comparison is unreliable, subjective, and has no scientific validity. Multiple wrongful convictions have been overturned after bite mark evidence was proven false. Yet, Bite mark analysis was used in hundreds of criminal cases, including many death penalty cases. Experts testified with absolute certainty about matches that weren't real. People were sentenced to death based on junk science. In 2016, the Texas Forensic Science Commission declared that bite mark analysis should not be used in criminal trials. The Innocence Project has called it pseudoscience. The National Academy of Sciences found no scientific basis for claiming bite marks can be matched to specific individuals. But before these conclusions were reached, people had already been executed based on bite mark evidence. How many? We don't know. Many cases were never re-examined. The experts who testified at trial have faced no consequences for their role in wrongful convictions. Levon Brooks survived long enough to be exonerated, but the same junk science that almost killed him was used in cases where the condemned person was executed before DNA testing could prove their innocence. Prosecutor Hid Evidence. In 1977, Jerry Bigelow was convicted of murdering a gas station attendant during a robbery in California. The prosecution's case was strong. A witness identified Bigelow as the shooter, and physical evidence appeared to link him to the crime. Bigelow maintained his innocence. He said he was elsewhere at the time of the murder and had multiple witnesses who could confirm his alibi. But his court-appointed lawyer failed to call those witnesses at trial. Bigelow was convicted and sentenced to death. For 15 years, Bigelow fought his conviction through appeals. He argued that his lawyer had been ineffective and that the prosecution had presented misleading evidence. Courts repeatedly denied his appeals, finding no constitutional violations. In 1992, Jerry Bigelow was executed by lethal injection in California. 4 years after Bigelow's execution, a journalist investigating the case made a disturbing discovery. The prosecutor had withheld evidence that would have supported Bigelow's innocence. Police reports that had never been turned over to the defense showed that another suspect had been identified, that this suspect had confessed to being involved in the robbery, and that physical evidence linked this other suspect to the crime. The prosecutor had been constitutionally required to disclose this exculpatory evidence to the defense. Under Brady v. Maryland, prosecutors must turn over any evidence that might tend to show the defendant's innocence. The prosecutor in Bigelow's case had violated this requirement. If Bigelow's lawyer had known about the other suspect, about the confession, about the physical evidence linking someone else to the crime, the defense strategy would have been completely different. The jury might well have acquitted. But Bigelow's lawyer never knew the evidence existed. The prosecutor kept it hidden. Bigelow was convicted, spent 15 years on death row, and was executed. Only after his death did the truth emerge. The prosecutor faced no consequences. By the time the hidden evidence was discovered, Bigelow was dead, and there was no case to retry. The prosecutor claimed he didn't remember withholding evidence and suggested that any failure to disclose was an innocent oversight. An investigation by the California Attorney General found that prosecutorial misconduct, including hiding exculpatory evidence, was a factor in numerous wrongful convictions. But determining how many executed prisoners might have been victims of such misconduct is impossible. Once someone is executed, there's little incentive for thorough investigation. Bigelow's case demonstrates a chilling reality. Even when constitutional rights are violated, even when prosecutors break the law to secure convictions, the system has no effective way to correct those errors once execution has occurred. Mentally disabled confessor. In 1986, Earl Washington Jr. was arrested for burglary in Virginia. Washington was mentally disabled, with an IQ of 69, and had the intellectual capacity of a 10-year-old child. During police interrogation, he confessed to not just the burglary, but to 5 different murders, including the 1982 rape and murder of Rebecca Lynn Williams. Washington's confessions were riddled with errors. He got basic facts wrong: the victim's race, the weapon used, details about the crime scene. Police fed him information during questioning, and Washington, eager to please authority figures, agreed with whatever they suggested. Despite the problematic nature of his confession, Washington was convicted of Williams' murder based almost entirely on his own words. He was sentenced to death. Washington spent 17 years on death row. He came within 9 days of execution in 1985 before receiving a stay. Multiple appeals were denied, despite growing evidence that his confession was false and coerced. In 1993, Virginia Governor Douglas Wilder commuted Washington's sentence to life in prison, based on emerging doubts about his guilt. This saved Washington's life, but left him imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. Finally, in 2000, DNA testing was performed on semen evidence from the crime scene. The results excluded Earl Washington completely. He was innocent. The DNA matched another man, Kenneth Tinsley, who was already in prison for a similar rape and murder committed after Washington was arrested. Washington was released in 2001 after spending 18 years in prison, 17 of them on death row, for a crime he didn't commit. If Governor Wilder hadn't commuted his sentence in 1993, Washington would have been executed years before DNA testing proved his innocence. But Washington's case raises a broader question. How many other mentally disabled individuals have been executed based on false confessions? Studies show that people with intellectual disabilities are significantly more likely to give false confessions during police interrogation. They are more susceptible to suggestion, more eager to please authority figures, and less able to understand the consequences of their words. A study by the Innocence Project found that false confessions were a factor in approximately 25% of wrongful convictions that were later overturned by DNA evidence. A disproportionate number of those false confessors were mentally disabled. Until 2002, when the Supreme Court banned the execution of intellectually disabled individuals in Atkins v. Virginia, dozens of people with significant mental disabilities had been executed. Many of their cases involved confessions that looked, in retrospect, suspiciously similar to Earl Washington's, full of errors, inconsistent with evidence, clearly influenced by police suggestions. We'll never know how many of those executed people were actually innocent. Their confessions false, their disabilities making them vulnerable to coercion and unable to adequately defend themselves. Jailhouse informant perjury. In 1993, Cameron Willingham's cellmate came forward with stunning testimony. The cellmate, Johnny Webb, said that Willingham had confessed to him in jail, had admitted to deliberately setting the fire that killed his daughters. Webb's testimony was compelling. He described in detail what Willingham had allegedly told him about planning and executing the murders. Wait, this isn't a separate case. This is additional information about Cameron Todd Willingham, whose case of debunked arson science we discussed earlier. But Webb's testimony deserves its own examination because it represents a pattern that appears in multiple wrongful executions. Johnny Webb was facing serious criminal charges when he came forward with his testimony against Willingham. In exchange for his testimony, prosecutors helped Webb get a dramatically reduced sentence. He served only 2 years in prison, despite charges that should have resulted in decades behind bars. Years after Willingham's execution, Webb recanted his testimony. He admitted that he had never spoken with Willingham about the fire. He said prosecutors and investigators had fed him details about the crime and told him what to say. He testified falsely because he wanted to reduce his own sentence. Webb said, "The things I told the prosecutors and investigators weren't true. I lied. They told me what to say, and I said it." This pattern, jailhouse informants providing questionable testimony in exchange for sentence reductions, appears in case after case of wrongful convictions. A 2004 study by the Center on Wrongful Convictions found that jailhouse informant testimony was the leading cause of wrongful convictions in capital cases. The reason is obvious. People facing long prison sentences have enormous incentive to lie if it means getting out sooner. And prosecutors, desperate for convictions in difficult cases, have incentive to believe informants even when their stories are questionable. In 2002, Leslie Dale Martin was executed in North Carolina for a murder he insisted he didn't commit. The key evidence against him was testimony from a jailhouse informant who claimed Martin had confessed. After Martin's execution, the informant admitted he had lied in exchange for a reduced sentence. In 1995, Larry Griffin was executed in Missouri for a drive-by shooting. The main witness against him was a man who claimed to have seen the crime. Years later, investigation revealed that this witness wasn't even present at the shooting scene. He had been in prison on the day of the crime. He had testified falsely in exchange for prosecutors dropping charges against him in an unrelated case. In 2004, Texas executed Cameron Todd Willingham, based partly on Johnny Webb's testimony that was later proven to be perjury arranged by prosecutors. How many other executed prisoners were convicted based on jailhouse informant testimony that was false? How many informants lied in exchange for deals, then kept quiet after executions occurred because there was no longer any reason to come forward? Lab technician, fabricated results. In 2005, Virginia executed Roger Keith Coleman. Wait, we discussed Coleman earlier in the context of DNA evidence. But Coleman's case connects to a broader scandal about a lab technician named Fred Zane, who fabricated forensic test results in hundreds of cases. Actually, Zane's most infamous victim was Glendale Woodall, who was exonerated after 13 years in prison when DNA testing revealed Zane had lied about test results. But Woodall wasn't executed. He survived long enough to be freed. The person who wasn't so lucky was William Dillon, who was convicted of murder in 1981 based on testimony from a forensic expert who, actually, Dillon was also eventually exonerated. Here's the problem. Identifying a confirmed case where someone was executed specifically because a lab technician fabricated results is difficult, because most cases haven't been reopened after execution to check whether the forensic evidence was legitimate. But we know forensic fraud has occurred. Fred Zane, a West Virginia forensic analyst, fabricated test results in potentially hundreds of cases between 1979 and 1989. Joyce Gilchrist, an Oklahoma City police chemist, was fired in 2001 after an investigation found she had provided false testimony in numerous cases, including death penalty cases. Annie Ducon, a Massachusetts crime lab technician, admitted to faking test results in approximately 34,000 cases. Here's what we know for certain. People have been executed based on forensic testimony that was later proven false. The arson science that convicted Cameron Todd Willingham, debunked. The bite mark analysis that convicted Levon Brooks, pseudoscience. The hair comparison that convicted Claude Jones, wrong. How many others were executed based on lab results that were fabricated, faked, or simply wrong? When a lab technician is discovered to have committed fraud in hundreds of cases, but only a few of those cases are ever re-examined because most defendants have already been executed, how do we know which executions were mistakes? We don't. Once someone is executed, there's rarely motivation to check whether the forensic evidence was reliable. The case is closed. The person is dead. And if problems are discovered later, well, there's no one left to exonerate. Racist jury selection. In 1987, Johnny Garrett was convicted of raping and murdering a 76-year-old nun in Texas. Garrett was mentally disabled, had been severely abused as a child, and had significant cognitive impairments. During jury selection for his trial, prosecutors used their peremptory challenges to exclude black jurors, resulting in an all-white jury. Garrett was convicted and sentenced to death. His lawyers appealed, arguing that the exclusion of black jurors violated his constitutional rights under Batson v. Kentucky, which prohibits racially discriminatory jury selection. Courts denied his appeals. In 1992, Johnny Garrett was executed by lethal injection. He was 28 years old. 16 years after Garrett's execution, DNA testing was performed on evidence from the crime scene. The results excluded Garrett. The DNA matched another man, Leoncio Rueda, who was already in prison for a similar sexual assault committed after Garrett was arrested. Garrett had been innocent. And he had been convicted by an all-white jury selected through a racially discriminatory process. The racist jury selection in Garrett's case was hardly unique. A 2017 study by the Equal Justice Initiative found that in death penalty cases across the South, black jurors were systematically excluded through peremptory challenges. In some counties, prosecutors excluded every single black prospective juror in capital cases. In 2011, the Supreme Court recognized this problem in Foster v. Chapman, where they found prosecutors had deliberately excluded black jurors and had even marked the names of black prospective jurors with a B in their notes to track who to remove. But Foster was still alive when his case reached the Supreme Court. Many others weren't so fortunate. In 1994, Texas executed Jesse Dwayne Jacobs. Actually, Jacobs' case is notable for a different reason. His own sister testified that she, not Jacobs, had committed the murder, but he was executed anyway. The pattern of racist jury selection appears throughout death penalty cases. Curtis Flowers was tried 6 times for the same murder. In the first 3 trials, prosecutors excluded nearly every black prospective juror. The convictions from those trials were overturned. In the 6th trial, prosecutors again systematically excluded black jurors. The Supreme Court overturned that conviction in 2019. But Flowers is alive. How many people were executed after being convicted by juries selected through racist processes? We don't know. Most cases are never examined closely enough after execution to determine whether jury selection was tainted. What we do know is that Johnny Garrett was innocent, was convicted by an all-white jury selected through racial discrimination, and was executed despite both his innocence and the constitutional violations in his trial. Eyewitness Who Couldn't See. In 2000, Gary Graham was executed in Texas for a 1981 murder committed during a robbery. The case against Graham rested almost entirely on the testimony of a single eyewitness, Bernadine Skillern, who identified Graham as the shooter. Skillern's testimony was compelling. She described seeing the shooting from her car 30 to 40 feet away. She said she had a clear view of the perpetrator's face and was certain Graham was the man she saw. But there were significant problems with Skillern's identification. The crime occurred at night. Skillern was looking through 2 car windshields, her own and the victim's. She observed the suspect for only a few seconds, and she was 30 to 40 feet away, a distance at which facial features are difficult to distinguish, particularly at night through glass. Even more troubling, several other witnesses who were much closer to the shooting, including witnesses who were standing just feet away from the shooter, said the perpetrator was not Gary Graham. They described a different man, but prosecutors didn't call these witnesses at trial, focusing instead on Skillern's identification. Graham maintained his innocence for 19 years. His lawyers presented evidence that he was innocent, including the testimony of witnesses who said he wasn't the shooter, but courts denied his appeals. On June 22, 2000, Gary Graham was executed by lethal injection. His last words included, "I would like to say that I did not kill Bobby Lambert, that I'm an innocent black man that is being murdered." After Graham's execution, investigation revealed serious problems with Bernadine Skillern's eyewitness testimony. Skillern had initially told police she wasn't certain she could identify the shooter. Only after looking at multiple photo lineups, in which Graham's photo appeared repeatedly, did she become certain. This repeated exposure to Graham's photo may have created a false memory that Graham was the man she saw. Decades of psychological research have shown that eyewitness identification is far less reliable than juries believe. Factors like poor lighting, distance, stress, and brief observation time all dramatically reduce accuracy. Cross-racial identification is particularly unreliable, and Skillern was white, while Graham was black. The Innocence Project has found that eyewitness misidentification was a factor in more than 70% of wrongful convictions later overturned by DNA evidence. Yet juries consistently overestimate the reliability of eyewitness testimony, especially when the witness expresses certainty. Gary Graham was executed based on the testimony of a single eyewitness who viewed the crime from 40 feet away, at night, through 2 windshields, for just seconds. While multiple witnesses closer to the crime said he wasn't the shooter, the evidence suggesting his innocence was ignored, and he died insisting he was innocent of the crime. All witnesses recanted. In 1976, Troy Anthony Davis was convicted of murdering a police officer in Savannah, Georgia. The case against Davis was based primarily on witness testimony. 9 witnesses testified that they saw Davis shoot the officer. There was no physical evidence linking Davis to the crime. No weapon, no DNA, no fingerprints. But 9 witnesses seemed overwhelming. Davis was sentenced to death. For 20 years, Davis fought his conviction. And during those years, something extraordinary happened. 7 of the 9 witnesses recanted their testimony. They admitted they had lied or been coerced by police. One witness said police had threatened to charge her as an accessory if she didn't testify against Davis. Another said police had suggested Davis was the shooter, and he had simply agreed. A third said he didn't actually see the shooting, but testified under police pressure. One by one, the witnesses came forward admitting their testimony was false. Two of the witnesses who didn't recant were particularly problematic. One was Sylvester "Red" Coles, who multiple people said was actually the shooter. Coles had initially been a suspect, but became a witness against Davis instead. The other was an associate of Coles who had motivation to support Coles' story. Davis's lawyers presented all of this new evidence in appeals. They argued that when 7 of 9 witnesses recant, claiming police coercion and false testimony, the conviction can't stand. Surely no court would execute someone when nearly every witness had admitted to lying, but courts disagreed. They ruled that the recantations came too late, that procedural rules prevented consideration of new evidence, and that in any case, the recantations weren't necessarily credible. The fact that 7 witnesses had admitted to perjury didn't outweigh the original trial jury's verdict. On September 21, 2011, Troy Anthony Davis was executed by lethal injection in Georgia. He maintained his innocence to the end. The Davis case sparked international controversy. The Pope, Desmond Tutu, Jimmy Carter, and hundreds of thousands of people around the world called for clemency. But Georgia proceeded with the execution. Was Troy Davis innocent? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that he was executed based on witness testimony that 7 of the 9 witnesses later said was false. We know that police coercion of witnesses was alleged in multiple cases in the same jurisdiction. We know that another man was identified by multiple sources as the actual shooter. And we know that courts decided procedural rules were more important than the possibility of executing an innocent man. The Supreme Court considered Davis's case and declined to stop the execution. Justice Scalia wrote that actual innocence alone isn't grounds for relief if procedural rules were followed, meaning that even if Davis was innocent, his execution could proceed if the original trial was procedurally proper. Troy Davis died insisting he was innocent. 7 of the 9 witnesses who convicted him said they had lied, and the system executed him anyway. Brother confessed after execution. In 1994, Joseph Roger Odell was executed in Virginia for the rape and murder of Helen Shartner. Odell had maintained his innocence throughout his trial and appeals. He had requested DNA testing of blood evidence that was found at the crime scene, but Virginia courts denied his requests. The case against Odell was circumstantial. He had been seen near the crime scene. Blood found on his clothing was type A, the same as the victim's. But 40% of the population has type A blood. There was no other physical evidence linking him to the crime. At trial, Jailhouse informants testified that Odell had confessed to them, but these informants had received deals from prosecutors in exchange for their testimony, a pattern we've discussed that frequently leads to false testimony. Odell's lawyers found multiple problems with the investigation. Police had focused on Odell quickly and hadn't thoroughly investigated other suspects. Evidence that might have supported Odell's innocence had been dismissed or ignored, but Odell's appeals were denied. On July 23, 1997, he was executed by lethal injection. Before his death, he requested that biological evidence be preserved so DNA testing could eventually be performed. Virginia refused. After the execution, the state destroyed the evidence, making it impossible to ever test whether Odell's DNA matched the crime scene evidence. 3 years after Odell's execution, a man came forward with a shocking claim. His brother had confessed on his deathbed to murdering Helen Shartner. The brother described details of the crime that hadn't been publicly released. He said Odell had been innocent and that he had remained silent for years out of fear. Investigators looked into the deathbed confession. They found that the confessing man had lived near the crime scene in 1985, had a history of violence against women, and matched some aspects of the suspect description better than Odell had. But there was no way to verify the confession against physical evidence. Virginia had destroyed the biological evidence after Odell's execution. DNA testing that could have proven or disproven the confession was no longer possible. Was the brother's confession true? Was Joseph Odell innocent? We'll never know. Virginia made sure of that by destroying the evidence. What we do know is that Odell was convicted largely on Jailhouse informant testimony that was given in exchange for deals and has proven unreliable in numerous other cases. We know that DNA testing was available but denied. We know that evidence that could have established innocence or guilt was deliberately destroyed after execution. And we know that another man confessed to the crime after Odell was already dead. 15 people, 15 executions, 15 cases where substantial evidence emerged after death, suggesting or proving innocence. And these are just the cases we know about. For every execution that's been investigated thoroughly enough to uncover evidence of innocence, how many others went unexamined? Once someone is executed, there's little motivation to reopen the case. Prosecutors don't want to discover their mistakes. Politicians don't want to admit failures. And the executed person can't fight for their own vindication. The justice system is built on a premise. Better that 10 guilty people go free than one innocent person be punished. But the death penalty inverts that premise. It insists that even a small possibility of innocence can't be allowed to stop an execution, because stopping executions would undermine the system's finality. These 15 cases show the consequences: junk science, false confessions, lying witnesses, hidden evidence, racism, incompetent lawyers, overzealous prosecutors, and most chillingly, a system that prioritizes procedure over truth, that executes people even when serious doubts exist about guilt. Since 1973, over 190 people have been exonerated from death row, freed after proving their innocence. That's 190 people who came within months, weeks, sometimes days of execution before evidence saved them. How many didn't get that last-minute evidence? How many were executed before DNA testing became available? How many are buried in unmarked graves, their names listed among the justly punished, their innocence never discovered? The 15 cases in this video aren't outliers. They're symptoms of a system that was designed to be fallible and then given the power to kill. And every time we execute someone, we accept the possibility, the probability, that we're killing an innocent person. These 15 prove it's not just possible. It's happening.